Chapter 20. Biogeography and Darwin's Theology. The Origin of Species included 2 chapters on the geographical distribution of species, comprising 10% of the book. At one point, Darwin contrasted 2 opposing claims about life: his own theory of descent with modification and that of independent creation. Certain geographical facts, he argued, were inexplicable on the theory of independent creation. Here Darwin assumed the role of theologian, telling us what a creator might not be expected to do. His purely materialistic theory of speciation seemed more reasonable to him than its supernatural alternative. Raising questions about a creator was perhaps not to be expected in the context of geography. But let's follow Darwin's argument and see where it leads. It turns out that he had a point, but in the end, perhaps not a very important one. Then we can turn from biogeography to Darwin's ideas about a creator more generally. Darwin strayed into theology a number of times in The Origin, but conspicuously so in his biogeography chapters. He also had a related purpose: to rebut criticism of his theory made by Louis Agassiz, the first geologist to provide good evidence that the Earth had experienced an ice age. Darwin and Agassiz. Agassiz reviewed The Origin of Species in 1860, saying that he considered Darwin's transmutation theory a scientific mistake, untrue in its facts, unscientific in its methods, and mischievous in its tendency. Years later, in his autobiography, Darwin found an opportunity to retaliate, referring to poor Agassiz, who had been attacked by Thomas Huxley. Swiss-born, Agassiz was appointed professor of zoology and geology at Harvard, where he founded Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. That was in 1859, the year of The Origin's publication. Agassiz, who served as the Harvard Museum's first director until his death in 1873, never accepted Darwin's theory of evolution. Today, he is sometimes identified as a creationist. His son, Alexander Agassiz, made a fortune in copper mining and made a large gift to Harvard University, supporting what later became the Agassiz Museum of Comparative Zoology. Later, Gould, Lewontin, and Wilson all had offices in the Agassiz Museum. In 1857, Louis Agassiz had written that the living world shows premeditation, greatness, prescience, omniscience, providence. All these things proclaim aloud the one God. Natural history, he wrote, must become the analysis of the thoughts of the Creator of the universe as manifested in the animal and vegetable kingdoms. In short, Louis Agassiz's ideas were about as far from Darwin's as can be imagined. Their conflict can be summarized in this way. Speciation, by Darwin's theory, was achieved by the chance accumulation of random mutations. Such a time-consuming method rendered implausible the claim that the same species would evolve more than once. To use a modern analogy, believing in the repeat appearance of the same species in different places was like arguing that the same randomly chosen lottery number could be the winning number in successive lotteries. So, a new species could be expected to evolve only once, and it would have what Darwin called a center of origin. Yet we plainly do find the same species in different locations, sometimes widely separated. Darwin's chapters were intended to explain how that happened, and at the same time to cast doubt on the creationist argument. A question largely discussed by naturalists, Darwin wrote, is whether species have been created at one or more points of the Earth's surface, or whether they migrated from their center of origin. Darwin's strategy was to substitute the migration or dispersal of species for their independent creation. Darwin's argument. Darwin accepted the Harvard professor's views about the Ice Age, but he also thought that the glacial period, to which Agassiz had drawn vivid attention, afforded a simple explanation of some otherwise hard-to-explain facts about the migration of species. Glaciation and the subsequent retreat of glaciers could account for the migration of species, whether they moved in search of a warmer or a colder climate. It could also explain the isolation of species that had earlier adapted to the cold, but now found themselves stranded in what had been inhospitable places, as in the case of the penguins in the Antarctic. The migration argument was flexible enough that it could explain almost any geographical location of a given species. In contrast, Louis Agassiz didn't need migration because he believed that species had been created at one or more points of the Earth. He noted that fish of the same species live in separate lakes with no waterway connecting them, so he concluded they were independently created at both locations. He also thought that the ready adaptation of creatures to their various environments testified to an intelligent plan. Darwin, in contrast, argued that any and all adaptation of species to whatever location could be explained by natural selection. Darwin allowed that difficulties sometimes arise in explaining migration in detail, yet he went on. The simplicity of the view that each species was first produced within a single region captivates the mind. He who rejects it rejects the vera causa of ordinary generation with subsequent migration, and calls in the agency of a miracle. Agassiz did indeed reject ordinary generation plus migration, and did invoke the agency of a miracle. In ruling out the latter, Darwin was reminding readers of his underlying strategy: to disqualify miracles as a legitimate explanation in science, and to replace them with what he called the laws impressed on matter. Claims about the natural world had to embrace material causes if they were to be regarded as scientific. In fact, materialism undergirded Darwin's whole enterprise. Darwin's next point was the essence of his reply. Organisms, including plants, through the agency of transportable seeds, migrate. If the difficulties be not insuperable in admitting that in the long course of time all the individuals of the same species, and likewise of the several species belonging to the same genus, have proceeded from some one source, then all the grand leading facts of geographical distribution are explicable on the theory of migration. As to the centers of origin that Darwin invoked, they are not known in anyone's theory. In The Greatest Show on Earth, Richard Dawkins asked, why would an all-powerful creator decide to plant his carefully crafted species on islands and continents in exactly the appropriate pattern to suggest irresistibly that they had evolved and dispersed from the site of their evolution? But no one knows the site of their evolution. We know very little about the origin of finches on the Galapagos Islands, for example. Did only one species arrive from Ecuador? Or from somewhere else? We don't know. Those found there now seem capable of interbreeding and vary only in small ways from one island to another. Nonetheless, those who are critical of Darwinism in other respects have little difficulty in accepting migration as a reality. Although questions have been raised about the plausibility of monkeys rafting themselves across the South Atlantic to account for their presence in South America, in short, Darwin was eager to assure Agassiz and to reassure his readers that his theory could account for the appearance of a given species in lots of different places. It is obvious, Darwin wrote, that the several species of the same genus, though inhabiting the most distant quarters of the world, must originally have proceeded from the same source, as they have descended from the same progenitor. In the case of those species which have undergone but little modification, there is not much difficulty in believing that they may have migrated from the same region. Darwin's critics are for the most part happy to concede the point and to accept migration as a reality. As Jonathan Wells has written, the migration hypothesis is not equivalent to Darwinism, and could be espoused by a believer in the divine creation of individual species. Finally, a pause to note the irony. Louis Agassiz was the Harvard professor. Darwin, the self-employed naturalist financed by his own private income. Yet, among biologists at least, Darwin is perceived as having won their debate. Such an outcome would be highly improbable today. Professionals are expected to defeat amateurs, and Harvard biology professors no longer appeal to miracles. Darwin as theologian. Barry G. Gale wrote in his book, Evolution Without Evidence, that given the relative paucity of evidence then available, Darwin was forced to rely on the argument that his theory was better than the doctrine of special creation, and this was the strongest line of argument in The Origin of Species. But what new evidence surfaced after The Origin was written? Fossils maybe, but they have drawn attention to lack of intermediate forms in the record. Otherwise, new difficulties for Darwinism, especially at the molecular level, have greatly exceeded any new evidence supporting it. Darwin addressed his religious belief in various places, notably his autobiography, parts of which were censored by his widow. As we saw above, he also raised theological issues in The Origin and in The Descent of Man. His voluminous correspondence tells us even more. Some of his letters are particularly valuable because he is less guarded in writing to friends than in his published work. In 1862, Darwin told the Harvard botanist Asa Gray that there seemed to be too much misery in the world. He could not accept, for example, that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created digger wasps with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. Asa Gray, 1810 to 1888, admired and praised Darwin, who in turn saw Gray as his best advocate. In the course of their extensive correspondence, they exchanged over 300 letters. Gray partly accepted Darwin's theory, but also argued that nature was filled with unmistakable and irresistible indications of design. One could say that Gray was an early exponent of intelligent design. He said that God himself is the very last irreducible causal factor and hence the source of all evolutionary change. In one of his letters, Gray asked Darwin what it would take to convince him of design in nature. Darwin replied, "Your question, what would convince me of design, is a poser. If I saw an angel come down to teach us good, and I was convinced from others seeing him that I was not mad, I should believe in design." Darwin allowed that his theories were not at all necessarily atheistical, but was unable to share Gray's worldview. He felt most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. Replying in 1873 to a different correspondent, this one in Utrecht, Darwin expressed his agnosticism. "I may say that the impossibility of conceiving that this grand and wondrous universe with our conscious selves arose through chance seems to me the chief argument for the existence of God. But whether this is an argument of real value, I have never been able to decide. I am aware that if we admit a first cause, the mind still craves to know whence it came from and how it arose." The autobiography included a section explicitly dealing with Darwin's religious belief. On balance, he decided, happiness in the world ultimately prevailed over misery. Natural selection played a key role in shaping that opinion. It may be asked, how can the generally beneficent arrangement of the world be accounted for? Some writers, indeed, are so much impressed with the amount of suffering in the world that they doubt if we look to all sentient beings whether there is more of misery or of happiness, whether the world as a whole is a good or a bad one. According to my judgment, happiness decidedly prevails, though this would be very difficult to prove. If the truth of this conclusion be granted, it harmonizes well with the effects which we might expect from natural selection. If all the individuals of any species were habitually to suffer to an extreme degree, they would neglect to propagate their kind. But we have no reason to believe that this has ever, or at least often, occurred. Some other considerations, moreover, lead to the belief that all sentient beings have been formed so as to enjoy, as a general rule, happiness. Philosopher Stephen Dilly is among those who have studied Darwin's use of theology. He used an Enlightenment-style theology in order to enhance the credibility of his argument or theory, Dilly said. As to the pain and suffering argument, Dilly quoted Darwin saying to a colleague, "What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low and horribly cruel works of nature." In The Descent of Man, 1871, Darwin included a section on belief in God, religion. He wrote, "There is no evidence that man was aboriginally endowed with the ennobling belief in the existence of an omnipotent God. On the contrary, there is ample evidence, derived not from hasty travelers, but from men who have long resided with savages, that numerous races have existed and still exist who have no idea of one or more gods, and who have no words in their languages to express such an idea." Darwin preferred the idea of a God who created a few original forms and then let the laws of variation and selection govern the outcome. It is just as noble a conception of the deity to believe that he created a few original forms capable of self-development into other and needful forms, he wrote in The Origin, as to believe that he required a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the action of his laws. At one point, he said that such laws were impressed on matter by the Creator. He took a harder line when it came to miracles, saying that the clearest evidence would be requisite to make any sane man believe in the miracles by which Christianity is supported. For the more we know of the fixed laws of nature, the more incredible do miracles become. The underlying problem, he thought, was that men at that time were ignorant and credulous to a degree almost incomprehensible by us. What were these fixed laws? He gave several examples right at the end of The Origin. They were growth with reproduction, inheritance which is almost implied by reproduction, variability from the indirect and direct action of the conditions of life and from use and disuse, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. But these were not real laws. Reproduction, for example, is not a law, and is natural selection a law? He clearly said so in his autobiography. The old argument of design in nature, as given by William Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. We can no longer argue that, for instance, the beautiful hinge of a bivalve shell must have been made by an intelligent being, like the hinge of a door by man. There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. Everything in nature is the result of fixed laws. It should be redundant to add at this point that natural selection is not remotely law-like. All attempts to state it as a law collapse into the truism that I reviewed in earlier chapters. Paul Nelson said that Darwin's other laws begged key questions. Inheritance, for example, requires the prior existence of an organism, or at least two organisms of differing sexes in a sexually reproducing species. But Darwin often postulated the existence of the thing he claimed to explain. In attempting to represent his own theory as a set of laws, Darwin hoped to show that biology resembled physics, but it may be questioned whether biology really has laws. One possible law, not mentioned by Darwin: all organisms die. In physics, on the other hand, it is reasonable to describe physical laws as existing without reference to a creator of those laws. In expounding his laws of motion, for example, Newton did not rely on and saw no need to appeal to a deity who might have created such laws. Wounded pride also seems to have played a role for Darwin. He recalled that while on board HMS Beagle, he was hardly laughed at by several of the officers for quoting the Bible as an unanswerable authority on some point of morality. So he reconsidered the Old Testament with its manifestly false history of the world, with the Tower of Babel, the rainbow as a sign, etc., etc., in attributing to God the feelings of a revengeful tyrant, the Bible was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus or the beliefs of any barbarian. The result was that he gradually came to disbelieve in Christianity as a divine revelation. The morality of the New Testament was beautiful, he allowed, but its perfection depended on our own interpretation, just as we today have to interpret metaphors and allegories. The result was that Darwin found it more and more difficult to invent evidence which would suffice to convince me. Darwin's mounting hostility to Christianity was suppressed by his widow, who removed some inflammatory comments from his autobiography. The following passage was not generally known until it was restored and first published by his granddaughter, Nora Barlow, in 1958. Thus disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress, and have never since doubted even for a single second that my conclusion was correct. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true, for if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all my best friends, will be everlastingly punished, and this is a damnable doctrine. In 1880, he wrote to a correspondent, "I am sorry to have to inform you that I do not believe in the Bible as a divine revelation, and therefore not in Jesus Christ as the Son of God." Rumors of Darwin's deathbed conversion are without any basis. He died in 1882.